De Gaulle did not advocate a dictatorship. The central authority could be tested by periodic expressions of the popular will. Rather, he envisioned a strong executive under a republican system with a bicameral legislature and an independent judiciary. In order that the state should be, as it must be, the instrument of French unity, of the higher interests of the country, of continuity in national policy, I considered it necessary for the government to derive legitimacy not from the Parliament, in other words the parties, but, over and above them, from a leader directly mandated by the nation as a whole and empowered to choose, to decide, and to act. On October 21, 1945, French voters elected the Constituent Assembly, a provisional legislature tasked with drawing up a new constitution. 3 weeks later, it affirmed de Gaulle as head of government by a nearly unanimous vote, which, as he wryly noted in his memoirs, was more a recognition of past services than an understanding of his vision for the future. As soon as the government began to operate, the historic dilemmas of the Third Republic re-emerged. They started with the very formation of the government on November 21, which, according to the Constitution, needed to be approved by Parliament. As the largest party in the Constituent Assembly, the Communists demanded the three most important cabinet portfolios: foreign policy, defense, and interior. Although de Gaulle refused to entertain this demand, he did feel obliged to grant the Communists significant domestic ministries, such as economy and labor. Within weeks, de Gaulle realized that he was losing the struggle to shape the new constitution. A conventional political leader might have accepted such a disappointment as the price of holding power, but de Gaulle was not prepared to trade his conviction for what others judged practical. All along his tortuous wartime course, he had demonstrated that the improbable could be transformed into the realistic. If he could not achieve the moral renewal of his society, he would give up. What most political leaders would consider fulfillment and what he had struggled and suffered to achieve. On November 19, he asked the Canadian ambassador whether Canada would provide domicile should he resign. In a January 1, 1946 speech to the Assembly in advocacy of his defense budget, he suggested that it might be the last time he would speak in this hemicycle. 5 days later, he left on vacation, returning on January 14 to tell Interior Minister Jules Moch in confidence, "I do not feel I am made for this kind of fight. I do not want to be attacked, criticized, contested every day by men whose only claim is to have had themselves elected in some small corner of France." On January 20, a Sunday, not quite 18 months after his triumphant return to liberated Paris, de Gaulle convened a special meeting of the cabinet. There, he read a brief statement outlining his disdain for the exclusive regime of parties and his irrevocable decision to resign, giving no indication of future plans. After shaking hands with his colleagues, he got into his car and drove off. His stunned associates were left with a task none could have imagined when entering the room: choosing a successor to an already mythic personality. They elected Félix Gouin of the Socialist Party, who would serve for 5 months. Historians have puzzled over the timing of de Gaulle's resignation. Clearly he was at odds with the procedures of the Third Republic, in place until the Constituent Assembly would complete its work on a constitution, which itself was trending in a direction he disfavored. But attacking the institutions he led as head of government could have appeared to demonstrate either political impotence or, possibly, an invitation to a Bonapartist coup. Yet, paradoxically, if he intended to realize the vision to which he had unfailingly kept faith through all adversity and doubt, namely, assuming power so as to infuse republican government with broad legitimacy, he needed to resign before the Assembly's work had been completed and not in protest at an existing constitution. What this master of timing may have miscalculated was the interval required for the political leadership to recognize his indispensability and mend its ways. The desert. De Gaulle's abrupt resignation, like his flight to London 5.5 years earlier, affirmed his readiness to break with official France when his convictions could no longer support its direction. In doing so, he elected to withdraw from events before they withdrew from me. But whereas the relocation to London elevated him to the center of world historical events, and the epic task of sustaining France in exile, he now found himself shrouded in provincial solitude, an exile in his own country. The gesture was in keeping with de Gaulle's carefully cultivated image as a man of destiny, standing apart from politics as usual, uninterested in power for power's sake. The de Gaulle family settled in La Boisserie, a country house dating to the early 19th century, which lay in the village of Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, some 140 miles east of Paris. German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer would later describe it as a very simple house that has only a few well-furnished rooms on the ground floor but otherwise is very primitive. Winters were gray and harsh, for there was no central heating. "This is not a gay place," said de Gaulle to a visitor. "One does not come here to laugh." In the war memoirs he composed during his self-exile, he described how he found peace in his austere existence. This section of Champagne is imbued with calm, wide, mournful horizons, melancholy woods and meadows, the frieze of resigned old mountains, tranquil, unpretentious villages where nothing has changed its spirit or its place for thousands of years. All this can be seen from my village. From a rise in the garden, I look down on the wild depths where the forest envelopes the tilled land like the sea beating on a promontory. I watch the night cover the landscape. Then, looking up at the stars, I steep myself in the insignificance of earthly things. During this period, de Gaulle made only one public intervention of long-term significance, a speech on June 16, 1946 in Bayeux propounding his vision for France's political institutions. 2 years and 2 days earlier, when the Allied beachhead was still tenuous a week after the invasion, de Gaulle first visited the Norman town. 6 months after his resignation, he recalled the importance of his installing a prefect there. It was here on the soil of the ancestors that the state reappeared. Yet the work of reconciling France's institutions with its historic mission was incomplete. The constitution for what would become the Fourth Republic was being drafted at the time, and de Gaulle remained convinced that whatever emerged from the Constituent Assembly would be a dead end. De Gaulle laid out his diagnosis of France's malaise with characteristic frankness. During a period no longer than 2 generations, France was invaded 7 times and went through 13 regimes. Such numerous disturbances in our public life had intensified France's ancient Gallic propensity for divisions and quarrels, finally resulting in the disaffection of the citizens toward institutions. A strong presidency was needed, situated above the parties, which would represent the values of continuity, as de Gaulle himself had done as leader of the Free French. Following Montesquieu, de Gaulle also argued for a strict separation of powers. It was very important that the president not be at the mercy of the legislative power, for this would result in a confusion of powers in which the government would soon be nothing more than an assemblage of delegations, in which the national interest would find no advocate, and in which any cabinet minister would be reduced to a mere party representative. A bicameral legislature would provide constituents with an upper house entitled to review and amend legislation passed by the lower house but also to propose bills to the National Assembly. In this manner, the French Constitution would harness the fertile grandeurs of a free nation grouped under the aegis of a strong state. This second Bayeux speech was also notable for an exposition of de Gaulle's thinking on democracy, a subject about which he rarely spoke. Unlike his American counterparts, de Gaulle identified democracy more commonly with its institutional framework than an enumeration of individual liberties. This is why, in the seminal Bayeux speech, he advocated democracy in the form of a biting analysis of the defects and ultimate futility of dictatorship. It is the fate of dictatorship to exaggerate what it undertakes. As the citizens become impatient with its constraints and nostalgic for their lost freedom, the dictatorship must, whatever the cost, be able to compensate with broader and broader accomplishments. The nation becomes a machine on which the master imposes a regime of unchecked acceleration. In the end, something has to give way. The grandiose edifice collapses in blood and misfortune. The nation is left broken and worse off. In sum, Republican government served as the best bulwark between chaos and tyranny. De Gaulle's appeal at Bayeux did little to hinder the final draft of the Constitution of the Fourth Republic, which retained parliamentary supremacy and the weak executive of its predecessor. It was ratified via referendum in October 1946. Despite de Gaulle's expectation that the country would quickly recall him, no summons came. He struggled against bouts of gloom with demonstrative stoicism, at times reaching apocalyptic moods. In 1947, he attempted to launch a national political movement that stood separately from the established parties. It evoked a brief exuberance before sputtering out. Meanwhile, overall domestic conditions stabilized and improved. Although France indulged in a merry-go-round of prime ministers, wellsprings of vitality re-emerged. The economy, with the aid of the US-led European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan, began to recover, and, by the early 1950s, France's well-educated workforce, technical expertise and integration into a US-sponsored system of open trade combined to achieve historic prosperity. The Fourth Republic collapsed in 1958 not so much from domestic challenges, as from its inability to establish a policy regarding its colonial possessions. It spent too many of the political gains of the economic recovery on three colonial crises: the effort to hold on to Indochina, the Suez intervention and, above all, the Algerian crisis. Failure in Indochina and frustration in the Middle East. Indochina was the first in a series of post-war trials testing the Fourth Republic's claim to France's former spheres of geopolitical influence. Conquered piecemeal by France from 1862 to 1907. The colony had been under dual Japanese occupation and Vichy administration since the fall of France in June 1940. In March 1945, fearing an Allied invasion and suspecting that the French colonists might mount an uprising, the Japanese overthrew their erstwhile collaborators and established direct rule. By the time of the Japanese surrender in August 1945, two powerful forces were preparing to exploit the vacuum: Ho Chi Minh's communist Viet Minh insurgency, which had opposed both the French and the Japanese during the war, and an Allied military campaign to retake the colony, involving Chinese, British and Indian troops, as well as a French expeditionary corps under General Leclerc's command. By early 1946, French forces appeared to have largely reasserted control over Indochina. But France's strenuous efforts achieved only a brief interregnum of tranquility. On the night of December 19, 1946, the Viet Minh set off dramatic explosions in Hanoi, signaling the beginning of another long and bloody war. By 1954, colonial rule in Vietnam had become untenable. Laos and Cambodia had gained their independence from France the year before. The Eisenhower administration, emerging from the Korean War, was unwilling to back France militarily in Vietnam. General Henri Navarre's strategy of luring Viet Minh General Vo Nguyen Giap into an open battle, by concentrating forces in the cauldron-like valley of Dien Bien Phu, had resulted in a debacle. Over the course of 8 weeks, Chinese-supplied North Vietnamese forces had trapped the French and in early May brought about their surrender. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, Pierre Mendès France, the only Fourth Republic premier for whom de Gaulle would later express respect, moved swiftly to conclude negotiations in Geneva over the future of Vietnam. According to the resulting agreement, France would abandon the colony, which would be divided along the 17th parallel between the Communist North and the anti-Communist South. De Gaulle, not in office during that drama, never forgot the lesson. Meeting with President Kennedy in May 1961, he warned the young American president against involvement in the region. As recorded in an official memorandum, President de Gaulle recalled the war France waged in Indochina. He stated his feeling that a new war could not lead anywhere even if waged by the U.S. If the U.S. feels that its security or honor compelled it to intervene, the French will not oppose such an intervention but will not participate in it, except of course if it were to lead to a worldwide war, in which case France would always be at the side of the U.S. The second post-war shock to France resulted from a joint Franco-British military operation to restore the West's position in the Middle East by invading the Suez Canal region in 1956 in league with Israel, which was pursuing its own separate national objectives. In 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser had taken over Egypt, deposing General Mohammed Nahib, who 2 years earlier had replaced the monarchy. Nasser created a nationalist regime that increasingly moved towards Soviet economic support and armed itself with Soviet weapons. In July 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been under French and British ownership. Britain was thus faced with the end of its preeminence in the region, and France with the prospect that an emboldened Nasser might redouble his support for insurgent nationalists in its own North African possessions, especially Algeria. In October 1956, in a secretly agreed coordination, British and French forces moved to seize the canal days after Israeli forces had invaded the Sinai Peninsula. The Eisenhower administration, viewing the Cold War as an ideological contest for the allegiance of the developing world, was transfixed by fear that the Soviet Union would use the occasion to co-opt the Middle East. This is why, on October 30, 24 hours after Israel's initial attack, the United States submitted a resolution in the Security Council ordering Israeli armed forces immediately to withdraw behind the established armistice lines. When this resolution was vetoed by Britain and France, Eisenhower took the issue to the General Assembly. On November 2, the General Assembly demanded an end to the hostilities by an overwhelming vote of 64-5. At an overnight session on November 3 to 4, it passed an even stronger resolution and began to discuss a United Nations peacekeeping force for the canal. On November 6, a run on the pound sterling took on alarming proportions. Contrary to previous practice, America stood at the sidelines and refused to step in and calm the market. These measures convinced Britain and France to call off the operation. Washington's disavowal of the Anglo-French action at Suez exposed the limits of NATO as an intergovernmental military alliance, and of America's commitments to its allies. London and Paris drew antithetical lessons from their misadventure. Britain, shocked by the decline of its historic role and chastened by its schism with Washington, strove to restore the special relationship with America. It would return to modifying elements of historic policies in exchange for enhancing its influence over U.S. decision-making. France, by contrast, with far less prospect of achieving this kind of influence over American choices, festered in frustration, creating a rift in perception within the Atlantic Alliance that would achieve its full expression after de Gaulle's return. Before that could happen, however, the chronic instabilities of the Fourth Republic merged with France's colonial crisis in North Africa, Algeria, and the return of de Gaulle. Conquered by France in 1830, Algeria held a special status amongst the French territories overseas. In the decades after annexation, waves of French and Southern European colonists settled along its coastline. By the 1950s, there were approximately 1 million of them, mostly French and known as the Pieds Noirs. The North African littoral, as we have seen, played a critical role in Allied military strategy during the Second World War. Algeria in particular advanced de Gaulle's personal strategy for attaining power. Unlike Tunisia, Morocco, or France's sub-Saharan colonies, the Algerian littoral had been constitutionally treated as an integral component of metropolitan France, with a status comparable to Corsica. It was regarded so much as part of the French homeland that, as late as 1954, Prime Minister Mendes France planned to move French weapons factories there, out of range of the Soviets. The notion of Algeria as a kind of sanctuary would not survive the year. That November, the territory was struck by a wave of guerrilla attacks organized by the National Liberation Front, FLN, which called for an independent state, sovereign, democratic, and social, within the framework of the principles of Islam. 91. In response to the challenge, Mendes France declared, "Never will any French government yield on the principle that Algeria is France." Although the French governor, Jacques Soustelle, among others, believed that economic development initiatives could stem the budding insurgency, convictions intensified over the following months. The CIA had first predicted an Algerian settlement within a year. After a few months, its analysts reversed their view and argued that France's humiliation at Dien Bien Phu and its unwillingness to face the realities, never defined, were helping to fuel the conflict in Algeria. Even left-leaning French governments found themselves locked in a cycle of military escalation. François Mitterrand, the future Socialist Party standard-bearer and French president who was then serving as Mendes France's interior minister, spoke for many on the left when he reiterated the prime minister's assertion, "Algeria is France." But now he added, "The only negotiation is war." What had been originally acquired as a beachhead for the projection of French power was turning into a cancer eating at the country from within. Pieds Noirs, enraged by the inability of the French government in Paris to protect them, formed vigilante groups defiant of elected authority. The French army grew resentful of the political class, whose indecisiveness it blamed for the stalemate. As government after government tumbled, six collapsed between the FLN's attacks in November 1954 and de Gaulle's return in June 1958, French public opinion became increasingly exasperated by this seemingly irresolvable crisis. With key elements of French society revolting against state authority, what started as an insurrection by Arab nationalists against French colonialism risked metastasizing into a French civil war. Algeria was the last act in the saga of French imperial retreat and the first act in de Gaulle's return to save France a second time. De Gaulle had been observing the growing paralysis from Colombey. First, he expected that his indispensability would be quickly recognized. But no party leader undertook the responsibility to encourage, much less support, a revision of the constitution compatible with de Gaulle's public list of the preconditions for his return. By May 1958, the domestic situation had reached the critical phase that de Gaulle had stipulated. A group of generals, including General Jacques Massu, the paratroop commander, in a coup-like appeal to French President René Coty, demanded that de Gaulle be appointed the head of a government of national safety. Simultaneously, the National Assembly was searching for a strong premier. It settled on Pierre Pflimlin, a member of the Christian Democratic Party, who proved at first hesitant and then unable to form a stable majority. Algeria continued to boil. De Gaulle maneuvered masterfully among the contending factions, refusing to take sides. He did not declare himself ready for office until all the parties had become deadlocked due to their incompatible goals. The Assembly increasingly feared a military coup and looked to de Gaulle to avert it. The army was drawn to the idea of de Gaulle's return because the former soldier was championing a strong state, which it interpreted as resolve to crush the Algerian insurgents. To reinforce the fear of a parachute descent in Paris, officers of the Algerian units bloodlessly seized Corsica, prompting Pflimlin's resignation. Each of de Gaulle's supporters misunderstood him to some extent. He used the army's pressure as a tool but did not aim to seize power from the barrel of a gun. His purpose was in fact not a new Bonapartism but a constitutional state strong enough to return the army to the barracks. By the same token, de Gaulle sought to be recalled to office in a constitutional manner and to abolish, not to serve, the existing political system. De Gaulle put forward no specific demand. Instead, he maintained an artful ambiguity, made himself available for exploration by each faction and without restricting his flexibility appeared to each as the best last solution to its worst fears. Maneuvering each of the contending forces into the position of supplicant, he was always negotiating from a position of purpose. As de Gaulle well understood, the political constellation in the spring of 1958 had by now brought about what was likely to be his last opportunity to fulfill what he believed to be the task assigned to France by history. But he had the wisdom to play it like a game of Chinese Weiqi or Go, which starts on a blank board, each party possessing 180 pieces, and where success is achieved through patience and a superior grasp of the evolving tactical situation. To have shared his ultimate program would have risked alienating all factions or driving them into precipitous action. Instead, he persuaded each group that advancing his candidacy was the best way to thwart its rivals. In the end, on May 29, 1958, President Coty invited de Gaulle to become the last Prime Minister of the Fourth Republic, extending the invitation through the Secretary of the Presidency. Throughout this period, de Gaulle conducted only one press conference, on May 19, near the end of the crisis, in which he described himself as a man who belongs to nobody and who belongs to everybody, and said he would return to power only by means of an exceptional act by the National Assembly that would recall him to office for the purpose of introducing a new constitution. 95. He had a word for all concerns. To the army, he said that its normal role was to be a servant of the state, on the condition that there was a state. To those worried about the threat he might pose to democracy, he pointed out that he had restored democratic institutions in France in 1944. Why should I, at age 67, begin a career as a dictator? 96. He ended the press conference by saying, "I have said what I have to say. Now I am going to return to my village and hold myself at the disposition of the country." On June 1, the multiple consultations came to an end, and de Gaulle appeared before the National Assembly for the first time since his resignation in January 1946. He read without emotion the edict that would dissolve the chamber and give him full power for 6 months for the drafting of a new constitution, which would then be submitted to a referendum. The debate lasted only 6 hours. The final vote was 329 to 224 for the investiture of de Gaulle as Prime Minister, a temporary springboard to his constitutional presidency. Twice in a lifetime de Gaulle had assumed the leadership of France, the first time in 1940 to rescue it from the consequences of national catastrophe, the second in 1958 as the only means of avoiding civil war. The first time, the once unknown brigadier general brought 4 years of solitary vision to their culmination with the liberation of Paris. The second time, already a legendary figure, he was recalled from internal exile to save the constitutional government from itself and to lead the French people to a post-imperial, but nonetheless dynamic and independent, role in the world. In this great task de Gaulle envisioned 4 phases: restoring France's constitutional structure so as to create a government with authority, finishing France's colonial adventures in a way that removed them as a canker in the body politic, designing a French military and political strategy which made clear the international indispensability of France in both defense and diplomacy, and, finally, defending that strategic concept against allies, especially a reluctant America. The Fifth Republic. De Gaulle ascribed the process by which the Fourth Republic was overthrown to 3 factors. In order to save the country while preserving the Republic, it was essential, first, to change a discredited political system, second, to restore the army to the path of obedience without delay, and, third, to place himself in a leading role as the only person who could bring about the requisite changes. Entering office, de Gaulle needed to transform his deliberate tactical ambiguity into a strategic design for overcoming the revolutionary turmoil he had inherited. Leftist domestic critics envisioned France's radical dissociation from Algeria as a simple and unambiguous task. In reality, the processes of French administration and settlement that had lasted for more than a century, as well as the war that had been ongoing since 1954, could not be switched off with the abruptness of changing a television channel. The army's commitment to keeping Algeria French had brought de Gaulle into office. Now he acted on the conviction that returning the military to its role as an instrument of national policy was not achievable by a single dramatic decision. It would require a process that, by gradually reducing the military role in civilian order, would preclude the possibility of military dominance. Governing by decree, de Gaulle had been given 6 months to develop a new constitution. In accordance with principles laid down in his Bayeux speech of 1946, the new constitution replaced the parliamentary supremacy of the Third and Fourth Republics, and its attendant tendency toward factionalism, with a largely presidential system. In the Fifth Republic, control of defense and foreign policy would be reserved to the president, who was elected for a 7-year term by indirect suffrage via electors, modified to direct election in 1962. To oversee the functioning of the government, the president would appoint a prime minister representing a majority in the popularly elected National Assembly. But, to prevent a deadlock between the executive and legislative branches, the president also had the right to dissolve the assembly and call parliamentary elections. On matters of overriding national importance, the president could make recourse to popular referenda, a method de Gaulle, if not his successors, employed with relish. In October 1962, he spearheaded the referendum campaign allowing for direct election of the president. While extricating France from Algeria, he deployed 2 referenda as demonstration that a majority of the country endorsed his program. It is likely that at the beginning of the presidency de Gaulle did not have a precise sense of his ultimate destination in Algeria, although he was determined to end a war that was preventing France from fulfilling its international and domestic missions. Returning to office, he undertook several simultaneous strategies, each compatible with these two desiderata which had won him his position, all without committing to a specific outcome. De Gaulle's artful ambiguity was on full display during his visit to Algeria in June 1958, shortly after becoming head of government. Addressing a rapturous crowd of Pieds Noirs, who took him to be their savior, de Gaulle said, "Je vous ai compris. I have understood you." The phrase encouraged the faith of those whose commitment to French Algeria had helped to put him in office, while doing nothing to limit his options. His choice of words may also have saved his life. A would-be assassin was on the scene in a nearby building as de Gaulle spoke, but set down his rifle when he heard de Gaulle's words. As a first move, de Gaulle ordered General Maurice Chal, the commanding general, to launch an all-out offensive to clear rebels from the countryside. The purpose was to crystallize his two options, either integrating Algeria into France via military victory or, if that failed, discrediting the army's case against a political settlement. At the same time, de Gaulle accompanied armed force with sweeping domestic reform. His Constantine Plan, named for the eastern Algerian city in which it was announced in October 1958, marked an ambitious humanitarian and economic development effort to industrialize and modernize Algeria. He was thus outflanking left-wing and Algérie Française voices simultaneously. In implementing his strategic direction, de Gaulle turned to the referendum procedure, this time brilliantly linking the ratification of the new constitution to a new arrangement for France's colonial possessions. Both the metropole and the colonies were invited to vote by universal suffrage on the new constitutional framework. By putting forward the concept of a French community, de Gaulle was able to supersede a thorny constitutional debate between two leaders of French colonial Africa, Léopold Sédar Senghor, later president of Senegal, who favored a federal solution in which Africans would become full citizens of France, and the colonies would be merged into two regional groupings, and Félix Houphouët-Boigny, former French health minister and later president of the Ivory Coast, who preferred a looser confederation. For each colony, there was a choice: approve the constitution and join the French community or be granted immediate independence. All but Guinea under Sékou Touré chose to remain in the French community, an institution sharing vague security functions. But the winds of political independence were blowing across Africa, and the community arrangement buckled within 2 years. In 1960, the Year of Africa, 14 francophone states gained their independence, thereby largely avoiding wars of national liberation. The two exceptions were Cameroon, where a bloody contest between nationalist insurgents and the French military raged for 9 years, and Algeria, which retained an intermediate status compatible with either a military or a diplomatic outcome. To secure African support for the community, de Gaulle undertook a 5-day cross-continental campaign in August 1958, during which he spoke in unusually rapturous tones of the new mission for France. In Madagascar's capital, gesturing to the ancient palace nearby, he declared, "Tomorrow you will be a state once again, as you were when the palace of your kings was inhabited." His Memoirs of Hope record his reception in the French Congolese capital of Brazzaville, whether in the beflagged streets of the city center or in the seething suburbs of Bakongo and Potopoto. The crowds were delirious with enthusiasm for the referendum. In a May 1969 memorandum to President Richard Nixon, I described the significance of de Gaulle's extraordinary constitutional referendum. There was, in it, more than sympathy for African nationalists or a shrewd leaning with the anti-colonial tide. De Gaulle's African policy mirrored his concept of grandeur as well as gratitude. His memoirs show clearly an obsession with France's civilizing mission, and he qualified the colony's independence with political, economic, and personal ties that left French influence and culture still dominant. In turn, the French-speaking Africans came to rely on his special brand of patronage. The result was that in Africa, if anywhere, de Gaulle made France a great power. The end of the Algerian conflict. Having completed the constitutional framework, de Gaulle steered his Algerian policy to its conclusion. One who saw France's predicament clearly was Mao Zedong, who predicted to FLN leader Farhad Abbas that France would not be able to sustain a military commitment to the conflict. At its current scale, you will see that they face many difficulties. France needs to support an 800,000-strong military and spend 3 billion francs a day. If that continues for a long time, they will collapse. De Gaulle left no record of the precise moment he arrived at the same conclusion. Nor was that unusual for him. With all his dramatic way of proclaiming ultimate goals, he generally presented them in a manner as to obscure the nature of the journey. A couple of instances illustrate this aspect of his conduct, one of them related to me by Paul Stellin, then Chief of the French Air Force. At a meeting discussing French national strategy, de Gaulle had asked the participants for their views on his NATO policy. Shortly afterward, Stellin, who had remained silent, was invited to de Gaulle's office. "Was your silence an expression of disagreement?" Stellin then indicated his reasons for disagreement, to which de Gaulle cryptically replied, "And how do you know that I am not traveling to the same destination but on my own route?" A second example of de Gaulle's aloof style of decision-making emerged in December 1958, during the drafting of his program for domestic fiscal reform. The proposed plan, the handiwork of a senior civil servant and economist named Jacques Rueff, proved highly controversial. While considering it, de Gaulle summoned Roger Goetz, a financial aide, to his office and observed that, in assessing the prospects of even the best thought-out proposal, a policymaker would be wise to reserve a one-third element of doubt. "You are the expert," de Gaulle said. "You will tell me tomorrow morning if you consider whether the plan has a two-thirds chance of success. If yes, I will adopt it." The next morning, Goetz affirmed his confidence in the Rueff plan, and de Gaulle accepted it. Proclaimed by edict and put before the French public in a radio address, it provided the economic basis for the de Gaulle presidency, which officially began on January 8, 1959. On September 16, 1959, de Gaulle abruptly crystallized the Algerian choices before France in a televised address. He put forward three options without definitively committing himself to any. As his biographer Julian Jackson writes, the first was independence or secession, scission, as de Gaulle dubbed it. A second option was what he described by the neologism of Francisation, which was his way of describing what advocates of Algérie Française called integration. The third option was the government of Algeria by the Algerians, supported by the aid of France and in close union with her, with a federal system internally in Algeria where the different communities would cohabit peacefully. De Gaulle favored the third option, which he called the association, but privately he mused that it might be too late to avoid the first, Algeria's total break from France. The first and third options involved a substantial element of self-determination for the country's Muslim-majority population, while the second envisioned the gradual merging of French and Algerians into a single people. 4 months later, in January 1960, with the military situation still not substantially improved. Pied Noir activists uneasy with de Gaulle's options began constructing barricades in Algiers. When the news was first reported, I was in Paris, having spent an early part of the day with a group of French military officers who had invited me to discuss my book Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. Understandably, the impact of the barricades overrode concern over nuclear strategy. Several of my interlocutors, mostly at the rank of colonel or brigadier general, blamed their president for the troops' sympathy for the Pied Noir rebels, arguing that whenever de Gaulle appeared on the scene he divided France, and hence he needed to be removed. The same day, I had lunch with Raymond Aron, the great French political philosopher. In a left-bank café, he exclaimed his dismay over the barricades. "I am becoming ashamed to be French. We are acting like Spaniards, in a state of permanent revolution." At these words, a diner at a nearby table rose, came over to ours, identified himself as a reserve officer and demanded an apology in the name of the French army. By January 29, many in France, and all of my acquaintances there, expected a military coup, perhaps even a parachutist descent on Paris. De Gaulle went on television that evening wearing his wartime uniform. After a stark description of the situation in Algiers, he addressed the French army, ordering it to tear down the barricades unconditionally. "I must be obeyed by all French soldiers. No soldier must, at any moment, and even passively, associate himself with the rebellion. In the end, public order must be re-established." 109. The next day, the barricades went down. It was an extraordinary demonstration of charismatic leadership. In April 1961, an abortive coup staged by the army marked the last upheaval of the Algerian settlers against what de Gaulle understood as his historic task, disengagement. Again, he took to television to denounce the rogue action in Algeria. "Now the state is flouted, the nation defied, our power degraded, our international prestige lowered, our role and our place in Africa jeopardized. And by whom? Alas! Alas! By men whose duty, honor, and raison d'être was to serve and obey." The putsch failed, but opposing sentiments did not disappear. On August 22, 1962, de Gaulle and his wife Yvonne remarkably escaped death by machine-gun-wielding secret armed organization, OAS, assassins in the Paris suburb of Petit-Clamart. As with the sniper fire during the Mass at Notre Dame Cathedral on August 26, 1944, de Gaulle refused to duck. Others were not so lucky. Some 2,000 French citizens were killed by the OAS in bombings and targeted assassinations in 2 years. In August 1961, 3 years into his presidency, de Gaulle began the process of preparing the French people for the eventual outcome. He started withdrawing troops from Algeria with the justification that they were needed for the defense of Europe. To the French colonists, subordinating the security of what was legally a province of France to European defense represented a blow to their self-image, and a revolutionary change in France's priorities. The French public may have become exhausted from colonial wars, but the colonists themselves, and most of all the army, had borne the brunt of the sacrifice and felt deeply deceived. The endgame came in the form of the Evian Accords, negotiated in secret between de Gaulle's ministers and representatives of the FLN in early 1962. This 93-page document created an independent state while safeguarding French strategic equities on its territory, including access to military facilities and preferential treatment for its energy companies. Of the 3 options de Gaulle earlier considered, this was secession light. De Gaulle announced an April referendum on the pact in metropolitan France. It won over 90%, overwhelming support that was bolstered by public disaffection with terrorist attacks by OAS remnants seeking to derail the accord. A subsequent vote in Algeria itself on July 1 endorsed the Evian Accords with 99.72% backing. 2 days later, France recognized the new state. Yet the promised mineral rights did not materialize, and France would conduct its final nuclear test in the Algerian desert 4 years later, in 1966. De Gaulle had turned Algérie française from a self-evident fact in the mid-1950s into an extremist slogan uttered primarily by the Pieds Noirs 5 years later. But by that time, the wide-ranging integrationist forces that in 1958 had helped propel de Gaulle into the presidency had been reduced to a fringe terrorist movement. 800,000 French colonists were expelled from Algeria by the new regime, which combined aspects of Islamism, socialism and Arab nationalism, or left to their own devices shortly after the signing of the peace accords. Fearing violence, 150,000 of the remaining 200,000 elected to migrate by 1970. As for the Algerian Muslims who had remained loyal to France, the Harkis, withdrawal left them defenseless against reprisals by the FLN, which considered them traitors. Around 40,000 were able to flee to France, but tens of thousands remained in Algeria and were massacred. De Gaulle viewed his action as a patriotic service in the cause of restoring French national self-respect and the French voice in international affairs. Algerian disengagement made available more resources for French economic development and military modernization. Once embarked on the process, he exhibited the same implacability that had propelled him forward ever since arriving in London in 1940. De Gaulle never responded to several suggestions that he express compassion for the French settlers fleeing what they regarded as their homeland. Nor is there any record of his ever having discussed the impact of his Algerian policy on himself. Though he did on occasion express emotions in public, the speeches in Bayeux and Paris in June and August 1944, for example, de Gaulle made it a practice never to permit personal feelings to override his sense of duty, or the requirements of the historical process, as he saw it. In his judgment, Algeria had become a drain on France, isolating it among allies and handing to the Soviet Union and other radical forces an irresistible opportunity for intervention. Amputating Algeria saved the vitality of the Fifth Republic. It was the price France had to pay for the ability to conduct its own independent foreign policy and to fulfill de Gaulle's vision of its role in the emerging world order. He was hardly engaging in hyperbole when, as his Algeria policy was unfurling in 1959, he privately characterized it as, perhaps, the greatest service I will have rendered to France. De Gaulle had defied history in order to channel it in a different direction. Germany as a key to French policy, de Gaulle and Adenauer.